Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, John. John, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Tom. So, John Sicard, I'm a software engineer by training, but I figured maybe you can all go on LinkedIn and see all the things that I've done and still not know who I am. So, maybe I'll start by saying things you can't read on LinkedIn. I've played drums, rock drums, for about 45 years, and I'm in a rock band. This is my absolute passion. I was able to meet one of my heroes of the day, Alice Cooper. So, that gives you an
Oh,
idea of the type of music that I listen to.
wow.
Musician at heart, just absolute love supply chain. I think I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation because of it. I've got two boys. Well, they're men now. Alex and Nicholas, married for 36 years,
Wow.
and hopefully another 36. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, a little bit about me.
And you are also CEO of.
Kinaxis, yes, CEO of Kinaxis. In fact, Tom, I just crossed over my 30-year mark just a few weeks ago. It's shocking to say out loud, 30 years. I guess I'm not done yet.
Good.
There's still more to do.
Cool, cool. And John, for the one or two people out there who might not be familiar with Kinaxis, can you give us a kind of a potted history?
Absolutely. I mean, Kinaxis, we have been, insatiable innovators around supply chain planning and orchestration for as long as I can remember. We serve some of the largest, most well-known brands in the world with end-to-end supply chain orchestration on a platform that's powered by AI. So it's essentially one platform to rule them all. And we're providing our customers with, I'd say, everything from the sales and operations planning all the way through to on time in full and production planning and everything in between, basically.
Yeah, and you're not kidding when you say innovators either. I mean, looking at the timeline on your website, you came out with an in-memory database back in the 90s, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, the 80s even.
The 80s, was it? There you go. That's how bad my memory is.
Yeah,
I need an in-memory database myself. And cloud solutions back in the early 2000s, and
yes.
AI and ML solutions in 2018 or something like that. So, that seems to me you're kind of at the bleeding edge of a lot of these things.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And, the 30 years I've been here, I've been able to actually witness a lot of it firsthand. We tend to think about what is needed decades before it's needed. In fact, a lot of people considered Kinaxis kind of like David Bowie, way ahead of his time. But now we're coming into our own, post pandemic. I think we're starting to see a worldwide, what I'll call a worldwide renaissance around how supply chains are going to be governed in the future. And so some of these innovations that we have been focused on for the past several decades are starting to become table stakes, frankly, for the new supply chain model.
Right. Such as?
Well, for one, I would say two narratives are colliding simultaneously that never collided before.
Okay.
Post pandemic, every board is asking every CEO, so what are you going to do next time? Clearly, our supply chain isn't, quote, as resilient
Mhm.
as we thought it once was. That's a common term that we're hearing. Now, simultaneously, many boards are responsible for ESG governance. And, people may not realize that supply chain as a discipline represents approximately 60% of the world's global emissions, just supply chain. And
Mhm.
of that, half of that is just food. And so, boards are saying, what are you going to do next time? And oh, by the way, can you do less harm at the same time? That wasn't a conversation you would hear, even 5 or 6 years ago, as commonly as you hear it now. And I'd say that's the nucleus, if you will, of the conversation that's driving this renaissance.
Good, good. That's good to hear, particularly as we're on the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast. And you've said as well that the most carbon neutral product is the one that's never made. Can you
Yes.
can you discuss that philosophy a little? How could it transform supply chain management? And also, if we're not making stuff, how do we make money?
Yes, exactly. Well, First I'll maybe start with a bit of a narrative around what supply chain is that maybe the listeners will find unique, even at least that, in other conversations I've had, people have said, I've never really thought about supply chain that way. First, I'll say supply chain is the oldest discipline in the world. Absolutely. Began when humanity began. It had one purpose only, and that was to serve humanity, to serve societies with the necessities of life. Maybe it started with, as I like to imagine it, somebody sourced the right sized stick, sharpened that stick, traded that stick for a handful of food. That's a supply chain there.
Right.
There's sourcing and distribution happening and trade.
Mm.
And it starts with the necessities of life. And the niceties came later, but it starts with the necessities of life. So, the only reason I describe this, Tom, first is to get people anchored on just how mission critical supply chain actually is. It's like the operating system for humanity. And so it's necessary. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We can't function as a society without it. Now, but as I said, it starts with the necessities of life, and niceties came later. And yes, I think the most expensive inventory is the one that you can't sell. So you source the material, you fabricated it, you put it in a warehouse somewhere, and you heated it up until someone might want it. This kind of just in case inventory is by far the most expensive and the most taxing to the planet.
Mm.
So yes, it is a philosophical statement to try to imagine, like with precision, exactly how many widgets will I need? What exactly is my demand? And I will say we are moving away from this outside in kind of perspective where I'm going to make an assumption as to how many I'm going to sell, and then I'm going to push it onto the market.
All right.
Even Laura Cesare has been talking about outside in, where it's like, well, you have to be able to operate your business in a much more high velocity way to absorb actual demand requirements. And so ideally, you get to the end of the year and you have zero waste. Theoretically, imagine you've only made exactly the number of cell phones or gadgets that you have sold in that year and not a single one more. Then that's really operating a supply chain at perfection. That is doing the least amount of harm to the planet while simultaneously serving your market with precision, what is required. Now it's theoretical. It's I'd say it's nearly impossible to be perfect, but we can be a lot better than we were.
Sure.
That's the point of this renaissance.
Sure. 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 As they say, aim for the stars, and if you hit the moon, well, you're not doing too bad.
No, exactly.
So, I mean, we've talked about the need for resilience as well, and how how can companies balance the need for resilience with the imperative for sustainability? Are there specific strategies that can help achieve both?
Well, I think there is. And first, the term resilient is hyper used right now, even to the point where sometimes when I use it, the person I'm talking to will
Oh, yeah, he's glaze
roll
over.
their eyes. Yeah, even though they're like, you know, they're being kind, but they're like, oh, there's that word again.
Yeah.
Well, I'm tired of that word. But I will say, just think of that word more so as its meaning, right? Resilience is the capacity to avoid or recover from hardship.
Hmm.
Think of it as that. And so, what you're trying to do is build a supply chain that can either avoid or recover from hardship very, very quickly. And we're now living in a world where, well, uncertainty is really the only certainty. In fact, there was a mathematician, I can't remember what school he taught at, but John Allen Paulos said, uncertainty is the only certainty there is.
All right.
And knowing how to live with insecurity is really the only security. It's a very powerful statement, but it gets you thinking, then how do I succeed if that's true? So I do think there are, post pandemic, people are starting to realize a couple of things. We're coming off of at least 3 decades with an absolute obsession for accuracy.
Hmm.
So much attention and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars being spent by Every company, not just collectively. I mean, every company will spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to see if they can squeeze out just 1 or 2 more percentage points of accuracy. And you might be aware of that terminology of forecast accuracy and that constant pursuit
Hmm.
for perfection. After the pandemic, here's the uncomfortable truth: every single one of those math models collapsed. Like in a heap of garbage, they collapsed. Even the machine learning algorithms, by the way. Now, it's not an indictment on math-based algorithms as a pursuit, and I have to be so careful when I say these words out loud, because a lot of mathematicians, I could raise the ire there of that crowd, and I don't want to. As I said, that's not the intent. It's not an indictment on math-based models whatsoever. It is an indictment, though, on the presumption that math-based models make you agile, make you resilient, and not by themselves, they sure don't. Not by themselves, they don't. And that's what we learned. So I do think there is a path forward that we can explore. It starts first and foremost. Maybe I'll start here and then pause with the realization that this madness, this absolute mad obsession for accuracy, has been at the expense of agility. Agility is a competence,
Hmm.
but we've spent decades just thinking about accuracy as the panacea. If only my plan were more perfect, I'd be in less pain. That was the assertion. Well, it's now being seen more so as a bit of a fool's errand. There's a competence missing there. And so I'll start there and say, the path to resilience starts with the realization that we've been missing a competence. And I would posture that that competence is agility.
Okay. Okay. That's fascinating. It's not something I think I've heard anyone on the podcast say before. So very, very
I
profound. I
hope
want to
that's
say
a good thing.
it is. It is. It is. It's yeah, no, it's a new take. So that's good. While I think it's fair to say technology is a significant driver of change, and that's why we're here on the podcast. It's not, I mean, it's obvious that it's not enough on its own, and you've talked about this in the past. Can you elaborate on how changes in techniques such as concurrency and orchestration can complement technological advancements to enhance supply chain sustainability?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that, and again, not to suggest in any way, shape, or form that technology isn't part of the solution here as we go forward. I think we've been missing a trick or two by applying so much attention to accuracy. The other thing I would say around technique is that we've also, I would say, we've been led down this wrong assumption that if you optimize every chain link, you've optimized the chain.
Mm.
And so, supply chain as a discipline has been focused on what I call functional excellence. I'm going to be the best demand forecaster in the world. I don't know what happens after I hand my forecast over. Okay. There's someone else 2 or 3 chain links down, and they're running some multi echelon inventory optimization algorithms to optimize inventory. And they don't necessarily know what's going on around them. This is equivalent to a sports team where it's perfectly legitimate for players to celebrate when the team loses if they win. The team, I to use a hockey analogy, I'm Canadian, so hockey is kind of the big sport in Canada. But I often say no one should celebrate a hat trick when the team loses 4-3,
Mm.
and yet those are the conditions we've created in supply chain. This siloed, cascaded approach has been part of the problem. When you have this, well, 2 things. One, you're using, you have an obsession for accuracy, but worse yet, you're obsessing over accuracy of each chain link separately. Then you haven't really optimized the chain at all, for one thing. The other thing you've done is you've created the conditions where teammates are operating in the dark.
Hmm.
There's blindness between them because they're so focused on just their functional excellence. They have no understanding of how does this entire system work. There is a lot of waste in that model, Tom. I'd say this, waterfall cascaded approach by definition is lethargic. It's slow moving. I've never talked to a practitioner that says, "Oh, our waterfall is really fast." They usually look at me and grin and go, "Yeah, it's a little lethargic." And who's last to know? Logistics. They're at the end of the, you know, warehousing. They're at the end. So that's that is one of the fundamental shifts in this technique, where it starts with the recognition that the techniques that we've been applying, this waterfall, siloed approach, is lethargic. Well, can you be simultaneously lethargic and agile at the same time? No. I mean, in fact, lethargy is probably the most poisonous element to agility. And so this comes back to, yeah, that narrative of let's talk technique first. Forget about the technologies. This notion of a cascaded technique, this waterfall, is lethargic. Lethargy, poisonous for agility. I'll pause there just to get a reaction if that resonates with you, Tom.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So, how do you fix that though?
Well, there's a couple of things I would say. There are a couple of prerequisites, I would say, when you move from what we describe as this waterfall approach, this cascaded approach, to use a term, to one that is concurrent.
Hmm.
When you move to a concurrent technique, you make it impossible to plan one function without simultaneously planning them all. So that's pretty fundamental. You have to sort of pause there and go, wait a minute. That means if I'm planning inventory, I'm going to instantaneously see the impacts on either side. If I'm doing a sales and operations plan in a concurrent environment, it's going to be impossible to create a candidate that breaks a constraint at a supplier. It could be 3 chain links down, 5 chain links down. Correct. So by definition, when you have a concurrent environment like that, where you plan everything simultaneously, there are no silos. You've essentially codified agility,
Right.
right? You've codified an agile framework versus a lethargic one. You've also, just by that simple technique change, the notion of moving from cascaded to concurrent, not only have you codified agility, but you've eliminated this flawed thinking of optimizing 1 chain link at a time. Those things don't, you never, I mean, now you're playing a team sport. Now
Right.
you're making it impossible for a player to score a hat trick and the team loses. There's no celebration in the room. So I'd say those are critical pieces there. I've often used the term transparency that comes with concurrency. One of the challenges, again, going back to the techniques of the past, this waterfall, this lethargic cascaded approach, it breeds blindness between functions. So common, that I would ask, if I ask people in operations whether they trust the people on the commercial side, and again, they never say no, but they grin. There's an answer in their facial expression, and it's not because they're bad people. It's
Sure.
not because they show up to work with malintent, harm their fellow employees. That's not the point. But there's blindness between them because the system's created that blindness, and well, you can't trust what you don't see,
Hmm.
right? And so now you start to have a trust problem with the technique. Fascinating. So again, when you start moving into this direction of concurrency, you codify agility, and you also make it flawlessly transparent, tip to toe. It's literally impossible not to understand the implications of your decisions on either side of you. And that wasn't the case in the old world. Well, by definition, that makes you agile. And the more agile you become, the more resilient you are, right? This is one of the key attributes, not the only one. I know a lot of listeners may say, yes, there's resilience in the physical supply chain too, and we can certainly have that conversation. But the point of this exercise around concurrency in supply chain in a supply chain governance model is to make you hyper agile. Now, the back to sustainability, the more agile you are, okay, the more likely you are to respond to uncertainty.
Hmm.
And right now, the only way to respond to uncertainty is to tax the planet more, carry more inventory. Well, that's again, people would just say, well, it's safety stock.
Yeah.
Safety stock is a tax on the planet. That's what that is. I'm not saying it isn't necessary to hold strategic inventory, but make no mistake, when you have cascaded safety stock through your entire bill of material, at every point you're taxing the planet. This comes back to the sustainability. Can you be more resilient, be more agile while simultaneously doing less harm? The answer is yes. Will you ever get to theoretical zero? Well, it's a great pursuit. We'll get better every single day. If you can get 1% better a day for a year, let me tell you, that's getting a lot better.
It sounds like a big change for organizations, though, and we know changing technology is very straightforward, changing people less so. So, how do you deal with the organizational disruption that making that kind of a change causes?
Yeah, you're bringing up an absolutely valid point, which is one of the reasons why I say, while this is necessary, and I've had shareholders ask me, what's the likelihood that people will adopt this new way of governing supply chain? My answer is always 100%. There's a 100% chance that people will move in this direction. What I don't know is at what speed. If you don't, you will perish. I think that's true. It's kind of like going back, Tom. Imagine saying you go back before the internet was born, and some people were early adopters of email,
Hmm.
and some people still, there was a group of people that would still lick some stamps. Now, eventually, if you asked, what's the likelihood that, people will continue to write letters and lick stamps to conduct business? There's a 100% chance that people are going to move away from that into electronic medium and email and so on. Now, when you do receive a letter, it's usually from a lawyer, you know? Anyway, all this to say, I think, we are moving in this direction. But to your point, the people management side of it has to be taken into account, which is why I often say it takes managerial courage to take that first step. Okay.
Hmm.
Because the other narrative that I'm hearing, Tom, there's another narrative that I'm hearing, and that's chief supply chain officers telling me, I kind of have to leave it better than I got it. There's a bit of that going on, right?
Good.
They've been practitioners for 25 years, but during that 25-year period, obviously nobody's lived through a global pandemic like we just did. And so this is now boardroom conversation. The renaissance is afoot. Some are adopting the movement earlier than others, but we're definitely seeing a bit of legacy pull there with chief supply chain officers saying, I need to leave it better than I got it. Now, in order to pull people along with you, I do think it's important to talk first and foremost about the shift in technique, not technology. One thing I've noticed, and I don't know if you've experienced this, there tends to be a lot of emotion around technology.
Hmm.
This is my software and I'm an expert in it and don't take it away from me. And there's that a bit of an emotional pull, I'd say. Whereas when you elevate the conversation away from technology and say, listen, let's just talk about ways of working, it changes.
Sure.
It becomes safer, I'd say, to talk about. And so when you describe the problem in those terms first, I think you get more adoption from the user community, right? That's where I'd say it would start. But certainly, change management has to be part of any project like this.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. What about the whole movement towards net zero, zero carbon, 100% zero carbon supply chains, and digital supply chains, obviously, as well? What are kind of key steps companies need to take towards that goal, and what benefits can they expect from such a transformation?
Yeah, I think the pursuit is right. When people say net zero, yes, the theorist would say, well, that's not going to be necessarily possible in all aspects of life. But that doesn't make the pursuit any less valid. The whole point of it is to say, can we do less harm?
Hmm.
We're doing too much harm to serve humanity, basically. When again, as I said 60% of the world's emissions comes from supply chain. Of that, 30% of that, half is food.
Hmm.
So you're like, okay, well, the food supply chain is pretty important. We're going to have to continue to till and farm and grow food and distribute it and keep it cool when it's supposed to, and all of that.
Mm.
It's valid. But can we do less harm? I think that is the point of it. Being digital, well, it's an interesting conversation. Most companies would, if you ask them, "Are you digital?" Well, everything's in a digital database somewhere. What's ERP? Big digital software that houses everything. The point isn't so much being digital, but it is more so how you are digital. So the point I was making about this cascaded approach, let me give you an example of where this our current digital strategy fails us. If you ask a practitioner how often their statement of demand is replicated in their supply chain, how many times is it copied? Well, we have a version that sits with the executives in the sales and operations plan, and then they hand it to the master schedulers. And what do you think they do? The first thing they do is change it. So now you're wow. So it's no longer now it's muted. So demand's mutable. Okay. So after the master schedulers finish, they hand it off to the capacity people. What do you think they do? Change it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not enough just saying we have to be digital. I'd say one of the attributes about 100% digital is making sure there's no duplicate data hanging around there. People, there's really only one truth.
Yeah.
There should be one statement of demand, one statement of supply. There should be one operating model for supply chain that govern at least the attributes that govern. If they're mutable between functions, you have absolute chaos, even if it's digital. So I'd say the attributes matter very, very much. And in fact, when we talk to customers about prerequisites to being concurrent, it starts with having one data structure to rule them all. There's one of these things that you learn when you talk to practitioners. If you ask them, do you ever go to a meeting where the first argument is about whose data is right? And again, everyone chuckles because they know. Now, that's a symptom of a problem.
Yeah.
That's not a problem. It's a symptom of one. The fact that everyone is allowed to have their own version of truth. So the future supply chain, you could argue about the data, but there's only one set of it. There's only one reality. Reality shouldn't be mutable between functions. Anyway, I do think I'd say appropriate digital content. It starts with the attributes that I just described, and I don't think you're ever going to get anywhere close to net zero or in that pursuit of net zero if you continue to have this, what I call a digital strategy that allows for mutation of truth between functions. That's just that is a path to pure chaos.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I mean, you've mentioned AI and ML a few times now, and as I said, according to the timeline on your website, it was back around 2018 that you launched, I think, your first AI and ML platforms or applications. What do you think?
Yes.
What do you think are some of the most promising applications of these technologies for enhancing sustainability and efficiency in supply chains?
There's a couple of things that we have a lot of interest in, around machine learning and AI. First, I'll say this isn't new technology. I know a lot of startups would want you to think that it's just new stuff, but every mathematician I talk to about how awesome and new it is, they roll their eyes at me and say, "Do you know how long we've been working on this?" Like, you know, the mathematics behind it is quite well known. Now, its application has been very interesting. We started thinking, first a use case that considers the supply chain as being a machine. So imagine that in your head. A supply chain is a machine designed by humans with a performance intent.
Okay.
Everybody I say that to would say, I agree with that. It is a machine. It's a virtual machine for sure,
Mhm.
designed with attributes and a performance intent. Okay. Well, one of the things is really hard for humans to do is to continuously monitor every design parameter of that supply chain, all tens and tens of thousands of them, and continuously monitor how right were your assumptions. And so machine learning algorithms can very simply continuously monitor as designed against as demonstrated. So there's a design intent, and then there's an actual demonstration in the real world. And certainly there's going, as I say, supply chains vibrate. It's kind of like driving a car. Car is a machine.
Mhm.
You have shock absorbers. Well, supply chains have shock absorbers too. And the whole idea is to absorb vibrations. But, in some cases we see supply chains that are vibrating so violently that, people can't even sit still. It's you're absorbing a tremendous amount of volatility. And in cases like that, machine learning algorithms can automatically adjust the design. That's just fascinating. Think about, and by the way, it may only do it certain months of the year. It's kind of like in Ottawa. You don't drive around in winter tires all year round, but there is a point in time where you better have, the design of your car will call for winter tires because otherwise you're sliding all over the road. It's very dangerous. That's just a simple analogy, but imagine, and we've seen this with customers where, I'd say certain raw materials just seems to be really difficult to get in September and October, just those 2 months. Yes, you can look at causal factors to figure out why, but it's more important for the algorithms to detect that for you.
Right.
So that's one area. I'd say the next, I'd say there's a lot of traditional uses right now. Even Kinaxis uses machine learning and AI to improve forecast accuracy, which we talked about earlier. But the one thing that these algorithms are able to do is ingest unstructured data, sentiment data, weather patterns, sporting events, all kinds of things, absorbing a tremendous amount of data that was impossible by, I'd say, traditional forecasting. And you're able to squeeze out more performance on the accuracy side. So there you go. The pursuit of accuracy isn't, there's no indictment on it. It's still a good pursuit. Um, but that's I'd say a more traditional usage of machine learning AI. And lastly, and I think this is going to be a huge, 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 huge value proposition for this technology, is to what I call automate the obvious. And you can only do this safely on top of a concurrent engine. When you think of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of transactions that are required to run a supply chain every single day, well, today automation doesn't cover the vast majority of those transactions. A lot of humans do.
Mhm.
And I believe we will get to a point where 80% of those transactions can be safely automated, hands free, from tip to toe. And when I say automating, it's not just, well, we're doing inventory transactions, we're automating those. Okay, well, that's one chain link. You're still stuck in the past, focused on one link at a time. Think about an entire supply chain where all transactions are being safely automated, or at least a large portion of them. That will be a huge step forward in an agile supply chain. Think of the speed at which you can operate when you can safely automate 80% of your transactions. And by definition, you'll be less wasteful. And if you're less wasteful, well, you're doing less harm to the planet. You're
Sure.
doing less harm to the planet, well, then your carbon footprint will shrink.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. For our listeners who are eager to implement more sustainable practices in their supply chains, what kind of practical steps would you recommend? How can they begin making a tangible impact immediately?
Well, you can't improve what you can't measure.
Mm.
So the immediate, I'd say step is is to explore ways of measuring the impact your decisions are having on the planet. I'd say traditional scorecarding of supply chain always has financial measures. What's on time in full and revenue and margin and inventory cost and expediting cost and cost. That's it. And so when you make business decisions or trade-offs, it's often governed by financial implications. And so, step one is to appreciate that every decision you make will have a positive or negative impact on the planet. Can you measure it? Okay, so we at Kinaxis, we certainly have a sustainability index of every decision you make. We tell the viewer, the person using the software, am I taxing the planet or am I helping the planet? It doesn't, it's just a data point that people weren't using before in their decision making process. That has got to be step one. It doesn't mean that it'll instantly turn into a massive improvement overnight, but that education, where people know every decision I make has an impact on the planet, not just the business. You have to be balanced.
Mm.
Yes, decisions I make have an impact on the success of the business I'm running. Yes, they also have an impact on the planet. So, let me be more balanced in how I track decisions.
Okay. Okay. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, John. Is there any question I did not ask that you wish I did, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
I think one thing that people might think about is that the difference between, say, a renaissance and going after a breakthrough versus just doing what you're doing now, only better. I think we are living through a point now where incrementalism is really the race to mediocrity, and people are realizing, yeah, I have to shake my head here, or I often use this analogy. When you rub your eyes and you get all kinds of colors, and you open them, and you have to wait for the colors to settle. It gives you a sort of fresh perspective on what you're viewing. I think people have to rub their eyes and let the colors settle, and start thinking about, what will I leave future generations? Right? If I'm a supply chain practitioner and 60% of the world's carbon footprint is related to the craft for which I am responsible for, then what will the future hold? Am I going to be an incremental thinker, or am I going to go after a breakthrough?
Mm.
It takes some degree of courage, I will say this, to take that step. But there are some phenomenal companies in the world that are already trailblazing a path. It's not like, you have the Unilevers and the Proctors and so on that are all moving in this direction already. Interestingly, they're already masters in, according to the Gartner Top 25, they're in this masters category, and yet they're trailblazing the next 30 years for us. So I would say, to the viewers, is recognize the value of taking that giant leap. It's a generational shift we're living through right now. It's not an incremental, oh, I just need to make it better for the next 3 years. No, if I don't, I might not survive 3 years. The mechanism may not survive the next 3 years. I've got to rethink the model for the next 30, so that the generations coming in after me will benefit from what I do now.
Very good. Very good. Okay. John, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed on the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Well, for Kinaxis, certainly, the website for me personally, LinkedIn. I love having conversations about this discipline, and I'm always open to debate and learn. Right, that's the thing when you have exchanges like this. You either learn a thing you didn't know, or you teach a thing that someone else didn't, and both are positive outcomes. And so, I love having exchanges like that. So people can certainly reach out and find me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Great. Superb. John, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.